Imagine a family so powerful that their influence stretched across continents, their name etched into the history of Europe for nearly 1,000 years. They began as modest counts in a small Swiss region, yet through a combination of shrewd strategy, clever marriages, and relentless ambition, they built an empire that spanned from the heart of Europe to the Americas. They were the Habsburgs, a dynasty whose story is filled with triumph, tragedy, and a level of political mastery that still fascinates historians today. Picture a young Rudolf of Habsburg in the 13th century, elected king of the Romans, taking his first steps toward shaping a dynasty that would dominate European politics for generations. Consider the marriages that followed, alliances carefully planned to secure thrones, wealth, and influence. A single wedding could bring the riches of Burgundy into the Habsburg fold. Another would unite the crowns of Spain and the Low Countries. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry," became the blueprint for an empire that relied more on diplomacy and bloodlines than on the battlefield. Yet power came with a price. Generations of intermarriage brought both political advantage and genetic challenges, giving rise to the infamous Habsburg jaw and a legacy of health struggles that would haunt their line for centuries. Their vast holdings were a marvel, but also a source of constant challenge, as rulers like Charles V struggled to maintain unity across lands that stretched further than any single administration could fully control. From religious conflicts and wars to dynastic intrigue and personal tragedy, the Habsburg story is a captivating mix of human ambition, strategy, and resilience. Welcome to our channel. For the next few minutes, we'll take you on a journey through the rise, glory, and eventual decline of the Habsburg dynasty. In this video, we'll explore how a family from humble beginnings became rulers of empires on which the sun never set, the clever strategies that fueled their expansion, and the enduring cultural, artistic, and scientific legacies they left behind. Join us as we uncover the fascinating world of the Habsburgs. Imagine a family so powerful, they ruled for 1,000 years. Their name became tied to kings, emperors, queens, and archdukes across Europe. From the Alps to the plains of Hungary, from the Spanish throne to the Holy Roman Empire, their influence shaped not just politics but also culture, religion, and war. The Habsburg dynasty, often described as the most successful royal family in European history, did not begin with grandeur. Instead, their rise was the result of a mix of clever marriages, political maneuvering, and a sharp eye for opportunity. What began with local Swiss counts eventually grew into an empire that would stretch across continents. Their story is not only about power, but about survival, persistence, and strategy. The origins of the Habsburgs can be traced back to what is now Switzerland. In the 10th and 11th centuries, they were simply minor nobles, landholders who controlled small territories around the Aargau region. The family's name itself comes from Habsburg Castle, built around the early 11th century. At that point, there was nothing to suggest that these counts would one day become rulers of vast empires. They were one family among many in a fragmented European landscape, where local lords held limited power and constantly competed with neighbors. Their importance lay in their ability to survive in this competitive environment, where families often rose and fell within a few generations. The real turning point for the Habsburgs came in the late 13th century, with the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg. In 1273, Rudolf was elected king of the Romans, which meant he was also the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. This election marked the family's first great leap forward. Before Rudolf, the Habsburgs had been no more than regional counts. With him, they entered the highest circle of European politics. His election was not inevitable. The Holy Roman Empire was an elective monarchy, meaning the princes of the empire chose their leader, and these choices were often unpredictable. Rudolf's victory came partly because the electors saw him as a safe option, someone who would not threaten their own power. Yet once he was in office, Rudolf used his position shrewdly. He consolidated the family's control over Austria, Styria, and other key territories, laying the foundation for centuries of Habsburg dominance. This was only the beginning. If there was one recurring theme in Habsburg history, it was the strategic use of marriage. Long before they became a symbol of dynastic power, the Habsburgs realized that wars were costly and uncertain, but marriages could bring new lands and alliances with far less risk. By marrying into other noble families, they could expand their influence without drawing a sword. This approach would become their trademark, summed up in the saying, "Let others wage wars, you happy Austria marry." One of the earliest examples of this strategy was Rudolph's arrangement for his children. His sons and daughters married into other powerful families, strengthening bonds across Central Europe. The Habsburgs were careful in choosing partners who could bring them lands, titles, or legitimacy. Unlike many noble families who sought short-term military victories, the Habsburgs thought in terms of generations. They were willing to wait, to plant seeds through marriage alliances that might only bear fruit decades later. By the 15th century, this strategy began to show remarkable results. The Habsburgs had firmly established themselves as rulers of Austria, and from there they expanded into Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond. The family's patience and long-term thinking gave them an edge over rivals. Their marriages tied them to Burgundian lands, to Spain, and eventually to the crowns of Portugal and the Netherlands. Through one union after another, they became a dynasty whose influence was felt across Europe and even overseas. Yet what made these marriages effective was not just the acquisition of land, but also the political stability they created. By tying themselves to different kingdoms, the Habsburgs created webs of loyalty and obligation. They could claim thrones not by conquest, but by inheritance, which gave their rule a certain legitimacy. Rivals often had to respect these claims, even if reluctantly, because they were rooted in law and tradition. It is easy to imagine the Habsburgs as cold calculators, but their rise was not always smooth. Many marriages brought challenges as well as benefits. The family often found itself entangled in disputes over succession, dragged into wars that were supposed to be avoided, or burdened with territories that were hard to manage. Still, compared to the bloody path taken by other dynasties, their approach allowed them to expand with fewer catastrophic losses. What makes the Habsburg story so fascinating is the mix of chance and strategy. They did not always control the outcome of elections for the Holy Roman throne, nor could they predict which alliances would endure. But they kept returning to the same guiding principle: build networks through family ties. In doing so, they transformed themselves from local Swiss counts into emperors who presided over a realm that shaped European history for centuries. Their roots, then, were not in glory or conquest, but in persistence and shrewd calculation. The imperial roots of the Habsburgs show us how power can grow quietly, through castles and marriages, through elections and inheritances, until one day it stretches across half the world. This beginning explains how a family that seemed ordinary at first became extraordinary, ruling for a millennium and leaving a mark that can still be traced today. The roots of the Habsburg dynasty show how a family of modest Swiss counts rose through patience and strategy, and by the late Middle Ages their greatest weapon was not the sword, but the marriage contract. If the first stages of their ascent had depended on chance, such as the election of Rudolph as king of the Romans in the 13th century, the next stage would be defined by deliberate planning. Their rise was captured in a saying that became almost a motto for the dynasty: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." The Habsburgs discovered that alliances sealed at wedding altars could achieve more lasting conquests than victories won on battlefields. Where other dynasties drained their strength through constant fighting, the Habsburgs strengthened themselves by turning kinship into empire. The phrase about Austria's fortune in marriage was not simply a clever line. It reflected a real and consistent policy. The Habsburgs, unlike many ruling houses of Europe, were not known for great generals in their early centuries. They did not build their empire through crushing defeats of their enemies, but through weaving together families, crowns, and inheritances. This marriage policy allowed them to avoid many of the risks of direct conquest while still expanding steadily across the map of Europe. At a time when kingdoms were often fragile and dynasties could die out within a generation, the Habsburgs made themselves indispensable through their willingness to marry daughters and sons into the most powerful courts. The success of this approach can best be seen by looking at some of the key unions that changed the map of Europe. Among the most decisive was the marriage that tied the Habsburgs to Burgundy. The Burgundian inheritance was one of the most coveted prizes of 15th century Europe. The Dukes of Burgundy controlled a wealthy and culturally vibrant region stretching from modern-day eastern France into the Low Countries. Their court was famous for its splendor and influence, and their lands were among the richest in Europe thanks to trade and industry in places like Flanders and Brabant. When Mary of Burgundy, the only child of Duke Charles the Bold, needed a husband after her father's death in 1477, the Habsburgs seized the opportunity. Mary married Maximilian of Habsburg, son of Emperor Frederick III. This marriage not only brought vast territories into the Habsburg orbit, but also placed them in the center of European politics. The union sparked wars with France, which also claimed parts of Burgundy, but it secured for the Habsburgs control over the Low Countries. More than lands, however, this marriage brought wealth. The revenues of Burgundy funded Habsburg ambitions for generations, giving them the means to compete with rivals on a continental scale. It also introduced them to the cultural and political networks of Western Europe, which would become essential in the centuries that followed. The marriage with Burgundy was only the beginning. The Habsburgs soon turned their eyes to Spain. In the late 15th century, Spain itself was undergoing transformation. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united two of the most powerful Iberian kingdoms, laying the foundations of a unified Spain. Their daughter, Joanna, was married to Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. This marriage was a masterstroke. It tied the Habsburgs not only to the wealth of Burgundy, but also to the crowns of Spain, which after the voyages of Columbus would soon oversee a global empire. The marriage of Joanna and Philip was not without difficulties. Joanna, often referred to by her cruel nickname, the Mad, suffered from mental illness, and Philip died young in 1506. But from their union was born Charles, who would later become Charles V, ruler of both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This was the ultimate triumph of Habsburg marital policy, the uniting of vast territories in Central Europe with the riches of Spain and its overseas possessions. Without fighting a single decisive war, the Habsburgs had assembled one of the largest empires in history. Another pair of crucial unions involved the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. In the early 16th century, these kingdoms were among the most contested regions in Europe, positioned between the Holy Roman Empire and the rising Ottoman Empire. The Habsburgs arranged marriages that gave them claims to both thrones. When King Louis of Hungary and Bohemia died at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 without an heir, his brother-in-law Ferdinand of Habsburg, who had married Louis's sister Anna, claimed the crowns. Through this marriage, the Habsburgs gained control over two strategically important kingdoms, although this also brought them into direct conflict with the Ottomans, who were pressing into Central Europe. By tracing these unions, a pattern becomes clear. The Habsburgs did not simply marry into wealth or prestige. They married into opportunities that could change the balance of power. Each union was a piece in a larger puzzle, fitting together Austria, Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and other territories into a single dynastic framework. At times, these marriages brought headaches as well as crowns. They left the Habsburgs ruling lands that were far apart and difficult to govern. They also made enemies among rival dynasties like the Valois of France, who felt encircled by Habsburg possessions. Yet the sheer effectiveness of this policy cannot be denied. By the middle of the 16th century, the Habsburgs had become the most powerful dynasty in Europe, and they had achieved it largely without the destruction of constant war. This marital strategy also shaped the identity of the Habsburgs themselves. Unlike dynasties that identified strongly with one kingdom, such as the Tudors with England or the Valois with France, the Habsburgs were a dynasty of many realms. They did not define themselves solely as Austrians, Spaniards, or Burgundians. They were all of these and more. Their sense of legitimacy came not from one homeland, but from the breadth of their possessions and the ancient traditions of the Holy Roman Empire. This made them flexible and adaptable, but also exposed them to the challenges of ruling diverse peoples with different languages, religions, and laws. It is also worth noting that their marriage policy had long-term costs. By repeatedly marrying within a limited circle of European royalty, the Habsburgs created a genetic bottleneck that would have serious consequences. Generations of intermarriage led to physical and mental health problems, most famously represented by Charles II of Spain, whose severe disabilities left him unable to rule effectively and whose death in 1601 without an heir ended the Spanish Habsburg line. The very policy that had brought them so much power also sowed the seeds of future decline. Even so, in the age of their greatest strength, the marriage policy of the Habsburgs was unmatched. They had mastered the art of using family ties to create a realm greater than any they could have won by conquest alone. Each wedding was not merely a celebration, but a calculated move in a dynastic chess game that spanned centuries. Their motto was not a boast but a guiding principle, one that explains why their empire grew so vast and why their name still resonates in history. The extraordinary rise of the Habsburgs through marriage had by the 16th century delivered them into a position unmatched in European history. Their domains stretched so far and wide that it was said the sun never set upon them. That saying captured the reign of Charles V, grandson of Maximilian of Habsburg and Mary of Burgundy on one side, and of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain on the other. Through this layering of dynastic unions, Charles inherited a collection of crowns that no single European monarch before him had held. He was Lord of Austria and the Habsburg hereditary lands, ruler of Burgundy and the Low Countries, King of Spain, Naples, and Sicily, Archduke of Austria, and after his election in 1519, Holy Roman Emperor. With Spain's possessions in the Americas and beyond, Charles presided over an empire that circled the globe. When Charles was born in 1500 in Ghent, no one could have predicted the full scope of his inheritance. His father Philip the Handsome died when Charles was only 6, and his mother Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, suffered from severe mental illness. Charles grew up under the guardianship of his Burgundian relatives before gradually assuming his responsibilities as heir to the vast Habsburg patrimony. By his teenage years, he was already ruling the Low Countries, and when Ferdinand of Aragon died in 1519, Charles inherited Spain and its new overseas colonies. That same year, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire chose him as emperor, a position he held for nearly 4 decades. The sheer geography of his empire was staggering, encompassing lands in Central Europe, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and the Americas. This was truly the first empire in history on which the sun never set. Yet holding such immense power came with immense challenges. Charles faced near constant pressure on multiple fronts. France, under Francis I, feared encirclement by Habsburg lands in Italy and the Low Countries, leading to decades of conflict between the two monarchs. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent pressed into Hungary and threatened Vienna itself in 1529. In the empire, Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church ignited the Protestant Reformation, fracturing religious unity across Germany and beyond. And even within Spain, Charles struggled with revolts, such as the uprising of the Comuneros in 1521. His reign was not one of unbroken triumph, but of constant juggling, as he attempted to keep together a collection of realms so vast and so diverse that no single person could truly govern them all effectively. Despite these difficulties, Charles embodied the zenith of Habsburg power. His position as both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain gave him authority over both the Old World and the New. His armies fought in Italy, his fleets sailed across the Atlantic, his governors administered lands stretching from Peru to the Philippines. He saw himself as the defender of Christendom, a ruler chosen to protect Catholic unity against both Protestant heresy and Ottoman expansion. Yet this universal mission placed impossible demands on his resources and his health. By the end of his reign, exhausted and disillusioned, he abdicated in 1556, dividing his inheritance between his son Philip in Spain and his brother Ferdinand in Austria and the Empire. This division created the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs, both of which would remain powerful for centuries, but never again united under a single ruler like Charles. The brilliance of Charles's reign was shadowed by one of the dynasty's greatest weaknesses, the costs of inbreeding. For generations, the Habsburgs had pursued their marriage policy with a single-minded focus on preserving and expanding their lands. This meant that they often married within a very narrow pool of European royalty, repeatedly joining cousins, uncles, nieces, and even closer relations. The short-term political advantages of such unions were clear, but the long-term biological consequences were devastating. The most visible sign of this was the so-called Habsburg jaw, a distinctive protrusion of the lower jaw that became more pronounced with each generation. Portraits of Habsburg rulers show the gradual exaggeration of this trait, which was more than cosmetic. It caused speech difficulties, problems with chewing, and in some cases, severe health complications. But the jaw was only the outward sign of a deeper problem. Generations of intermarriage concentrated harmful genetic traits, leading to infertility, miscarriages, mental illness, and physical disability. Nowhere was this more tragically evident than in the Spanish line of the Habsburgs. By the 17th century, the dynasty was plagued by weak and sickly heirs. Charles II of Spain, who reigned from 1665 to 1601, is perhaps the most extreme example. He suffered from multiple disabilities, could barely speak or eat properly, and was unable to produce an heir. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburgs and sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, which reshaped the balance of power in Europe. The very strategy that had brought the Habsburgs to their zenith, the relentless pursuit of dynastic marriages, had also undermined their future. Even during Charles V's reign, the cracks created by the pursuit of universal monarchy were visible. Religious conflict tore at the unity of his empire. Luther's 95 Theses, posted in 1517, unleashed a wave of dissent against the Catholic Church that spread rapidly through German lands. Charles, a devout Catholic, saw it as his duty to defend orthodoxy. Yet he was constrained by the realities of imperial politics. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire, who had elected him, valued their independence and resisted his attempts to impose religious conformity. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Luther refused to recant, and Charles declared him an outlaw, but the new ideas could not be suppressed. Over the following decades, Protestantism spread, dividing Germany and making unity impossible. The Reformation was not merely a religious challenge, but a political one. Many German princes adopted Protestantism not only out of conviction, but also to assert their autonomy from imperial control. For Charles, this meant that his empire was riven from within. He fought wars against the Protestant princes, most notably the Schmalkaldic League, but even when he won victories, he could not impose lasting settlements. By the time of the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, he was forced to accept the principle that rulers could choose the religion of their territories, effectively acknowledging the permanent division of Christianity within the empire. This religious fracture reflected a deeper truth. The Habsburg Empire under Charles was too vast and too diverse to be held together by one man. His territories stretched across Europe and the oceans, but they were bound together only by dynastic accident, not by coherent administration or shared identity. The burdens of defending so many frontiers, financing so many wars, and reconciling so many conflicting interests proved overwhelming. Charles's abdication was an admission of this reality. His decision to divide the empire between his son and his brother was practical, but it also marked the end of the dream of a universal Habsburg monarchy. Yet even in decline, the legacy of Charles V was immense. His reign symbolized both the glory and the fragility of the Habsburg system. At its height, the dynasty had achieved a reach unmatched in history through marriages and inheritances. At the same time, the very methods that had created this vast empire, dynastic unions, and the pursuit of religious and political unity, also generated the internal weaknesses that would lead to fragmentation. The story of Charles and his descendants shows how the greatest power can carry within it the seeds of its own undoing. The reign of Charles V showed both the brilliance and the strain of the Habsburg experiment. His abdication in the middle of the 16th century divided the family's possessions into two great branches, Spanish and Austrian. Spain would dominate much of Europe and the world for more than a century before its line collapsed in the early 18th century. Austria, meanwhile, became the steady core of Habsburg power, carrying the dynasty forward for another 200 years until the end of the First World War. This shift from a globe-spanning empire to a dominion centered in Central Europe marked the beginning of the dynasty's long sunset. Though their reach narrowed, the Habsburgs remained resilient, adapting to new challenges and changing political landscapes, until at last the world around them transformed too completely for their empire to survive. The Spanish Habsburg line ended in 1601 with the death of Charles II, leaving the Austrian branch as the standard-bearers of the dynasty. For the next century and a half, Vienna became the heart of Habsburg rule. Their lands included Austria proper, Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Italy and the Low Countries. Though smaller than the vast empire once ruled by Charles V, it was still one of the largest and most complex realms in Europe. The Habsburgs faced constant pressure from neighbors such as France, Prussia, and the Ottoman Empire, and from within, they struggled to maintain cohesion among their diverse subjects. The dynasty adapted, but each adaptation reflected the slow retreat from universal empire toward regional authority. One of the most remarkable figures of this period was Maria Theresa, who came to the throne in 1740 after the death of her father Charles VI. Her accession triggered the War of the Austrian Succession, as rival powers challenged her right to rule under the pragmatic sanction that her father had put in place. Maria Theresa faced the invasion of Silesia by Frederick the Great of Prussia and attacks from other European powers. Yet despite these challenges, she proved to be a determined and skillful ruler. Though she lost Silesia, she defended the core of her inheritance and preserved the Habsburg monarchy. More than survival, she achieved reform. She modernized the state's administration, strengthened the military, and brought a sense of unity to her disparate lands. Maria Theresa's reign also marked the beginning of the modern Austrian identity within the Habsburg monarchy. While earlier rulers thought of themselves as universal emperors or defenders of Christendom, Maria Theresa ruled as a pragmatic sovereign, focused on the survival and efficiency of her dynasty in a Europe increasingly dominated by strong centralized states. Her legacy was carried forward by her son Joseph II, who pursued enlightened reforms, though often with limited success. The Habsburg monarchy was changing, no longer the sprawling empire of Charles V, but a regional great power with ambitions tempered by the realities of 18th-century politics. In the 19th century, the figure who came to symbolize both the endurance and the decline of the dynasty was Franz Joseph. He ascended the throne in 1848 during a time of revolutionary upheaval across Europe. The revolutions of that year threatened to tear apart the monarchy, as nationalist movements rose in Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere. Franz Joseph, still a young man, faced immense challenges from the start. His reign would last for nearly 7 decades, one of the longest in European history, and during that time he saw the monarchy transformed by both internal pressures and external defeat. Franz Joseph presided over a world in which nationalism was steadily eroding the foundations of dynastic empires. The Habsburg monarchy ruled over Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, and others. Holding such a patchwork together became increasingly difficult as the 19th century progressed. In 1867, following Austria's defeat by Prussia at the Battle of Königgrätz, Franz Joseph agreed to the Ausgleich, or compromise, which created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. This arrangement gave Hungary equal status with Austria, while leaving other nationalities dissatisfied. The compromise preserved the monarchy, but it was a sign that the old centralized vision of Habsburg rule was no longer viable. Franz Joseph himself was a figure of dignity and perseverance, but his reign was marked by personal tragedy. His brother Maximilian, who had been installed as Emperor of Mexico, was executed there in 1867. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in 1889 in the Mayerling incident, a scandal that shocked Europe. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was assassinated in 1898. These personal losses mirrored the gradual erosion of the monarchy's strength. Though Franz Joseph remained a symbol of continuity, his empire was increasingly fragile, held together by tradition rather than real unity. By the early 20th century, the Habsburg Empire was often described as a relic of the past. While Germany, Italy, and other nation-states had unified and modernized, Austria-Hungary remained a conglomerate of nationalities bound together by loyalty to the dynasty. The empire still possessed considerable resources, but its political system was outdated and unable to address the demands of its many peoples. The Habsburgs had once thrived by adapting through marriage and diplomacy, but in an age of nationalism, those tools were no longer sufficient. The final blow came with the First World War. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne, in Sarajevo triggered the conflict. The empire entered the war as one of the Central Powers, allied with Germany, but its military was ill-prepared, and its internal divisions made the war effort difficult to sustain. Franz Joseph, by then in his 80s, died in 1916, leaving the throne to his grandnephew Charles I. Charles was well-meaning and sought peace, but he had inherited an empire already collapsing under the strain of war. By 1918, defeat was inevitable. The nationalities within the empire declared independence one by one. Czechs and Slovaks formed Czechoslovakia, South Slavs created Yugoslavia, Hungary declared itself independent, and other regions either joined neighboring states or formed their own republics. The centuries-long Habsburg monarchy dissolved almost overnight. Charles went into exile, and Austria was reduced to a small republic. The end of the Habsburg Empire marked the close of one of the most extraordinary dynastic stories in history. For nearly 1,000 years, the family had shaped European politics, first through shrewd marriages, then through the might of empire, and finally through resilience in the face of decline. From the election of Rudolf in the 13th century to the abdication of Charles I in the 20th, the Habsburgs had ruled longer than any other European dynasty. Their sunset was not sudden but gradual, a fading of global power into regional authority, then into survival against nationalism, and finally into dissolution in the fires of World War. Even in their decline, the Habsburgs left behind a deep imprint. Vienna remained a cultural capital, shaped by centuries of imperial patronage. The dynasty's legacy could be seen in architecture, music, law, and the complicated map of Central Europe. Their story is one of both triumph and tragedy, of brilliance and fragility. The sunset of the Habsburg dynasty was the end of an era, not just for Austria, but for the old Europe of dynasties and empires. The world that followed would be dominated not by families that ruled for centuries, but by nations that defined themselves in new ways. The Habsburgs had risen from a castle in Switzerland to rule an empire on which the sun never set. They had married their way to power, seen their bloodlines weaken through inbreeding, fought to preserve unity against the tide of religious and political division, and finally watched their empire dissolve under the pressure of nationalism and modern war. Their sunset was inevitable, yet the glow of their long reign still colors the history of Europe. To understand their story is to understand the transformation of the continent itself, from medieval feudalism through early modern empire to the nation-states of the 20th century. The story of the Habsburgs does not end with the dissolution of their empire. Even after their political power faded, their influence continued to shape culture, art, science, and the identity of Central Europe. The dynastic achievements of the family had extended far beyond battles, crowns, and territories. Centuries of patronage and engagement with intellectual and artistic life had left marks that outlived the political structures they built. In Vienna, Prague, and Madrid, the legacy of the Habsburgs can be seen in palaces, churches, libraries, and universities, each reflecting a commitment to fostering culture and learning. Their reign coincided with periods of remarkable artistic achievement, and they actively encouraged architects, painters, composers, and scientists to create works that would define eras. In the 16th century, under Charles V and his successors, the Habsburg courts became centers of intellectual life. Scholars from across Europe were drawn to Vienna and other Habsburg cities, where they engaged in debates on law, philosophy, and theology. The dynasty had a special interest in the sciences, supporting early studies in astronomy, medicine, and natural history. Their patronage helped preserve knowledge and encourage inquiry at a time when Europe was transitioning from the medieval period to the early modern age. Libraries and collections assembled under Habsburg rule became invaluable repositories of human knowledge, with volumes and manuscripts that remain important to historians today. Art flourished under the Habsburgs as well. They commissioned buildings, palaces, and churches that combined grandeur with sophistication, often blending Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque styles. The Hofburg in Vienna, the Escorial in Spain, and Schönbrunn Palace all bear witness to the dynasty's architectural ambition. Painting also thrived under their support. Artists such as Titian were employed by the family, producing portraits that conveyed not only likeness but also the power, dignity, and prestige of the Habsburgs. These images communicated authority across Europe and reinforced the dynasty's symbolic presence, even in places far from their actual rule. Music was another sphere of influence. Court chapels supported choirs and composers, laying the groundwork for traditions that would flourish into the classical period. The dynasty's patronage helped cultivate an environment in which music became a defining element of cultural identity in Central Europe. Science and scholarship were closely tied to the Habsburgs' broader goals of governance. A well-informed administration required knowledge, and the family supported studies in law, cartography, medicine, and military science. Universities in Vienna, Prague, and other Habsburg cities benefited from this investment, producing educated elites who could serve the state and further European knowledge. In medicine, Habsburg hospitals and scientific inquiry helped improve public health, while in law, codification of legal systems contributed to more organized governance. Their interest in science was not always purely practical. They sought to understand the world in ways that would enhance both prestige and competence. The dynasty's influence is also visible in religious and philosophical thought. As devout Catholics, the Habsburgs championed the Church, yet they were also patrons of humanist learning. They navigated the challenges of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation with both political acumen and intellectual engagement. Jesuit schools, funded and encouraged by Habsburg rulers, became centers for education, shaping generations of European elites. By investing in both faith and reason, The dynasty fostered a culture in which learning was valued, even amid political and religious upheaval. Despite the collapse of Austria-Hungary in 1918, the Habsburg legacy continued in Europe and beyond. Many members of the family survived in exile or retained ceremonial positions, maintaining connections with European nobility. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs still exists today, with descendants who preserve the memory and traditions of the dynasty. Though they no longer wield political power, these surviving lines serve as reminders of the dynasty's historical reach. The family maintains an interest in historical preservation, culture, and philanthropy, bridging the gap between the past and the present. Their name continues to carry weight, in part because of the centuries of influence associated with it, and in part because of the fascination with the empire they once ruled. Modern fascination with the Habsburgs extends beyond their surviving descendants. Historians and enthusiasts are captivated by the complexity of their story. The ascent from Swiss counts to rulers of a global empire, the mastery of marriage as a political tool, the handling of religious and political crises, and the eventual decline in the face of nationalism and modern warfare. The Habsburgs represent both the possibilities and limitations of dynastic power. Scholars study them not only for their political accomplishments, but also for what their rise and fall reveal about European history, society, and culture. Their story illustrates how leadership, strategy, and adaptability can shape the destiny of a continent, while also reminding us that even the greatest power can be fragile. Cultural memory has been particularly persistent. Habsburg palaces, museums, and libraries remain major tourist and scholarly destinations. Cities such as Vienna, Prague, and Budapest bear the architectural and urban imprint of their rule, with streets, squares, and monuments reflecting centuries of imperial administration. Festivals, music performances, and exhibitions often celebrate Habsburg history, underscoring the continuing role of the dynasty in European cultural life. Through these tangible legacies, the family continues to influence the way people understand art, architecture, music, and governance. The fascination with the Habsburgs also extends into popular culture. Literature, films, and television series frequently explore their lives, blending historical fact with drama. Stories of court intrigue, dynastic marriages, wars, and personal tragedy resonate with audiences, emphasizing human aspects of power. From the portraits of rulers to the diaries and letters preserved in archives, the family's human dimension becomes as compelling as its political achievements. Readers and viewers are drawn not only to the grandeur of empire, but to the personal stories of ambition, loyalty, and misfortune that characterize the dynasty. Scientific interest in the Habsburgs has not waned either. Geneticists study the consequences of centuries of intermarriage, using the family as a case study in hereditary health issues. The distinctive physical traits and medical challenges of Habsburg descendants illustrate both the power and the risks inherent in dynastic strategies that prioritized consolidation of wealth and territory over genetic diversity. Researchers also examine how the family's administrative, legal, and cultural innovations contributed to the development of modern European governance, law, and institutions. Their reign is an intersection of political, scientific, and cultural history, offering insights into multiple dimensions of human endeavor. Beyond Europe, the global reach of the Habsburgs, particularly during the Spanish Habsburg period, left lasting impressions on the Americas and Asia. Their rule oversaw the early colonization of the Americas, the establishment of trade networks across the Pacific, and the integration of distant territories into European political, economic, and cultural systems. The administrative structures, educational initiatives, and religious missions set up under their authority shaped the development of colonies, influencing societies in ways that persisted long after the dynasty's direct rule ended. In many ways, the legacy of the Habsburgs is a story of continuity amid change. They began as minor counts in Switzerland, expanded through marriage and inheritance to rule a continent-spanning empire, and adapted over centuries to shifting political and social circumstances. Even as the world around them transformed, through the rise of nation-states, revolutions, industrialization, and world wars, the Habsburg imprint on governance, culture, and identity remained. Their ability to endure as symbols of history and culture highlights the lasting impact of dynastic power, even after political control has vanished. The family's continuing relevance today can also be seen in academic discourse. Historians examine the Habsburgs to understand imperial structures, diplomacy, and the interplay between personal ambition and broader historical forces. Political scientists study their administration as a model for managing complex, multi-ethnic states. Cultural historians and art scholars explore their patronage networks to trace the evolution of European artistic and intellectual life. Even outside academia, the Habsburg story informs understanding of leadership, strategy, and adaptation, providing lessons applicable beyond the historical context. In tracing the Habsburgs' lasting impact, it becomes clear that their significance is not limited to political dominance. They shaped the contours of European thought, culture, and identity. Their empire was a laboratory for governance, blending diverse peoples, religions, and traditions into an administration that balanced unity and autonomy. Their support for education, science, and the arts created legacies that enriched European society and continue to be studied and admired today. By commissioning works of art, fostering scholarship, and preserving knowledge, they left behind resources that continue to inform culture and history. The Habsburgs captivate because their story combines achievement and vulnerability, power and limitation. Their rise from Swiss counts to emperors on whom the sun never set demonstrates strategic brilliance. Their use of marriage, diplomacy, and political foresight created vast empires. Yet their decline, shaped by inbreeding, nationalist pressures, and global conflicts, shows the fragility inherent even in extraordinary power. Their cultural and intellectual legacies, however, endure, ensuring that their impact continues to be felt long after the last emperor left the throne. Today, whether through architecture, music, literature, historical study, or surviving descendants, the Habsburgs remain a presence in Europe and beyond. Their story is studied, celebrated, and sometimes mythologized, reflecting the enduring fascination with a family whose reach spanned a millennium, whose ambitions shaped continents, and whose influence continues to echo through centuries of European history. They remind us that the interplay of power, culture, and human ambition can leave a legacy far greater than the borders of any kingdom, and that even after the fall of an empire, its contributions can persist in ways both tangible and intellectual.